Walk into Cass Technical High School in Detroit. The original building. Opened in 1922. Take a moment to actually see it. 12 stories of ornate brick and terracotta rising above Woodward Avenue. A limestone facade with arched windows tall enough to flood classrooms with the kind of light that makes you want to think. Marble corridors. A rooftop greenhouse where students grew plants for biology classes. A 1,600-seat auditorium with acoustics precise enough to rival professional concert halls. An indoor swimming pool. A broadcasting studio. Metalworking shops with skylights. This was a public high school, built for the children of auto workers and factory laborers. Built with public money in a working-class city. Built, and this is the detail that stops you, with the explicit conviction that the children of ordinary people deserve surroundings worthy of serious thought. Now drive 20 minutes in any direction and find a school built in 1975, or 1988, or 2003. Flat roof, concrete block walls, fluorescent lighting humming at a frequency that induces low-grade headache, dropped ceilings, windows sized more like vents than openings, hallways wide enough to move bodies through but empty of any visual intention. A building that communicates at every surface that what happens here is a processing operation, that the children inside are units of throughput, not minds being formed. Something happened between those two buildings. Nobody voted on it. No official policy declared that beauty was no longer appropriate for children. No architect announced that inspiration was a luxury item. It just happened. Across every state, in every city, simultaneously, and almost completely. Why? Quick pause. These documentaries take weeks of research to build right. No studio, no algorithm bait, just obsessively sourced history. If this is the kind of content you want more of, subscribe now. We're building something here, and early subscribers are the whole reason it survives. Takes 2 seconds. Helps more than you know. Alright, back to it. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was deliberately built, and who built it, and why. In the late 19th and early 20th century, American school architecture operated under a philosophy that was unapologetic about its ambitions. The school building was not a shelter for education. It was an argument for education. It was the physical embodiment of a democratic promise that the American experiment, whatever its failures, was serious about the idea that every child, regardless of parentage, regardless of neighborhood, had a claim on the best that civilization could offer. The man who articulated this most forcefully was not famous outside his profession. William B. Ittner was the superintendent of school buildings for the city of St. Louis from 1897 to 1910, and over that period he designed over 100 schools that would become templates replicated by municipalities across the country. Ittner believed, with the conviction of someone who had thought carefully about evidence, that the building itself was a teacher. That a child who passed through corridors with proportioned arches and spent 8 hours in classrooms with high ceilings and generous windows was receiving an education that no curriculum document could provide. An education in what beauty feels like, what permanence feels like, what it means to be taken seriously by the world you've entered. His schools had operable windows on both sides of every classroom to create cross-ventilation before mechanical systems existed. They had southern exposures calculated to maximize daylight in winter and minimize heat in summer. They had cloakrooms, libraries with dedicated reading alcoves, and exterior brickwork detailed with the kind of care normally reserved for civic buildings. These were not extravagances. Ittner worked within municipal budgets. He simply refused to accept that budget constraints required architectural surrender, and the results spread. By 1920, cities from Portland to Pittsburgh to New Orleans were building public schools that looked, and this is not an exaggeration, like small universities. The message encoded in every brick, you matter. What happens here matters. Come in. That message had a lifespan. The first thing that killed the beautiful school was not a budget cut. It was an idea. In the 1920s and accelerating through the 1930s, a revolution was sweeping through architecture schools, planning departments, and the design offices of every institution that shaped the built environment. It went by different names in different contexts: modernism, functionalism, the international style, but its core proposition was simple and, to its adherents, morally serious. Ornament was dishonest. The Viennese architect Adolf Loos had declared in 1908 that ornament was crime. a provocative formulation that spread through European avant-garde circles with the speed of a genuinely useful scandal. The argument was that decorative elements in buildings were a form of cultural regression, an appeal to primitive instinct that sophisticated modern design should transcend. A building should express nothing other than its structure and function. Anything added on top of that, the carved limestone, the arched window, the patterned brickwork, was a lie told in stone. This was not a fringe position. By the 1930s, it was the emerging consensus of the American architectural establishment. The Bauhaus school, displaced from Germany by the rise of the Nazis, reconstituted itself partly at American universities, Harvard's Graduate School of Design chief among them, and embedded these principles into the training of an entire generation of architects. The implications for school design were direct and devastating. If ornament is dishonest, then the decorated school building is a building that is lying to the children inside it. The marble corridor is theater. The arched window is sentimentality. The rational response, the modern, honest, intellectually defensible response, is the clean concrete wall, the flush aluminum window frame, the flat roof without cornices. School boards, eager to appear sophisticated and forward-thinking, hired the new generation of architects trained in these ideas. State education departments published design standards that reflected the new aesthetic. The visual vocabulary of progressive civic architecture, which had meant ornamentation, permanence, and civic pride, quietly inverted. Progressive now meant stripped, spare, and functional. The shift wasn't announced. It percolated. It arrived in memo format, in updated building codes, in the subtle preferences of the consultants who approved designs. By 1945, the idea that a school should look impressive was already beginning to seem slightly naive. Ideology set the table. Demographics flipped it over. In 1946, American soldiers came home from the war and did what soldiers throughout history have done upon returning from places where death was the daily weather. They had children. An enormous number of children. The baby boom is a phrase so familiar that it has lost its power to shock. So consider the actual numbers. Between 1946 and 1964, approximately 76 million babies were born in the United States. The school-age population expanded at a rate that had no historical precedent. Between 1950 and 1970, American public school enrollment grew from 25 million students to approximately 52 million. Double. In 20 years. School districts were not built for this. The infrastructure wasn't there. The teachers weren't there. The buildings were not there. And the money, the always insufficient money allocated to public education, was strained to a breaking point trying to keep up with the demographic wave. The political imperative became speed and volume, not quality and permanence. Buildings needed to go up fast. They needed to be replicated with minimal design cost. They needed to be constructed with materials that were cheap, available, and required minimal skilled labor to install. Prefabricated concrete panels. Standardized window units produced in bulk. Flat roofs, because a flat roof is faster and cheaper to build than any alternative. Dropped ceilings to hide ductwork rather than integrate it. Fluorescent fixtures rather than windows, because artificial light is easier to control than daylight, and the fixtures could be ordered by the gross. State education authorities produced standardized plan books. A district could select from 12 or 15 pre-approved building templates, submit the paperwork, and have a contractor break ground within months. The design process, the expensive, time-consuming process of adapting a building to its specific community, its specific site, its specific student population, was eliminated. And here is the economic logic that made this unchallengeable. A standardized school built in 1958 cost roughly 30% less per square foot than a designed school of comparable size. When you need to build 100 schools in a decade, that margin is not abstract. It is the difference between opening schools and children sitting in hallways. Speed won. It had to. The ideology had cleared the philosophical ground, and the demographics loaded the gun. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched a metal sphere the size of a beach ball into orbit. Sputnik beeped its way around the Earth every 96 minutes, and the United States experienced something close to collective psychological crisis. If the Soviets could put a satellite into space, it meant their rocketry was ahead. If their rocketry was ahead, it meant their engineers were better. If their engineers were better, The argument cascaded. It meant their schools were producing superior technical minds. The implication was electric and terrifying. American education was failing. Congress responded with the National Defense Education Act of 1958, the most significant federal investment in public education to that point in American history. The NDA poured money into schools, but with a very specific ideological payload. The crisis, as defined by Washington, was not about beauty or civic pride or the formation of democratic citizens. It was about science, mathematics, and technical competency. The school was reframed, at the highest levels of policy, as a production facility for engineers and scientists in an arms race. This framing had architectural consequences that were immediate and lasting. Schools that could demonstrate laboratories, technical workshops, and STEM facilities received federal support. Schools designed around humanistic values, the library as a civic heart, the auditorium as a community space, the corridor as a place of beauty, found those values harder to defend in funding applications. The standardized, utilitarian building was now not only cheaper and faster. It was patriotic. It was efficient. It was serious. A building with carved stone over the entrance was a building spending money on the wrong things. The Sputnik crisis completed what modernist ideology and demographic pressure had begun. It gave the utilitarian school its political justification. Three forces converging in roughly 15 years. An intellectual establishment that had decided beauty was dishonest. A demographic wave that made speed and cost non-negotiable. A geopolitical panic that turned the school from a civic temple into a technical training facility. The beautiful school didn't stand a chance. Here is where the story becomes genuinely painful. Because while American school districts were systematically stripping beauty from school buildings on the grounds that it was expensive, sentimental, and educationally irrelevant, researchers were quietly accumulating evidence that pointed in exactly the opposite direction. The field of environmental psychology, which studies how physical spaces affect human cognition, behavior, and emotional state, has spent the last 4 decades producing findings that William Ittner would have recognized immediately as confirmation of everything he believed. In 2015, researchers from the University of Salford in the United Kingdom completed a study of 3,000 students across 27 primary schools, tracking how the physical environment of their classrooms affected academic progress over a year. The findings were stark. Factors including natural light, air quality, temperature control, and visual complexity, the presence of color, variation, and detail in the immediate environment, accounted for approximately 16% of the variation in learning progress between students. 16% is enormous. It is the difference between a student who advances at expected pace and one who falls significantly behind. And this effect was produced entirely by the building, before a single teacher spoke a single word. The natural light finding alone is damning. Studies at schools in California, Washington, and Colorado found that students in classrooms with the most natural daylight, large windows, high ceilings, skylights, progressed 20 to 26% faster in reading and math compared to students in classrooms with minimal natural light. This finding has been replicated across multiple countries and contexts. It is not controversial in the research community. William Ittner put large windows in his schools and calculated their sun angles with care because he believed, intuitively and from observation, that light mattered for learning. He was right. He was right in 1905, and the evidence now confirms it in every dimension. The ceiling height research is equally pointed. High ceilings, studies show, activate what researchers call the cathedral effect, a measurable shift in cognitive mode toward abstract, expansive, creative thinking. Low dropped ceilings, the kind installed in the 1960s and 70s to reduce HVAC costs, demonstrably suppress this cognitive mode and encourage detail-focused but uncreative processing. We paid to install the ceilings that made children think smaller. The acoustic data follows the same arc noise levels in the typical open-plan school of the 1970s, another cost-saving design trend, were found to impair speech intelligibility and reading development in young children at rates that researchers described as alarming. Every modernist design choice made to save money, every one producing a measurable cost to the children inside. The old way was better. The data is unambiguous, and we demolished most of it. Here is the tragedy in its full shape. The beautiful American school did not die because someone decided children didn't deserve beauty. It died because three separate forces arrived at the same moment, and each one, in isolation, seemed rational. Modernist ideology made Ornament indefensible on intellectual grounds. The baby boom made speed and cost non-negotiable on practical grounds. Sputnik made technical efficiency non-negotiable on political grounds. No single one of these forces could have done it alone. Together, they constituted a perfect storm, one that swept through the American educational landscape in less than 20 years and left behind a built environment that we are still living with and still paying for, in ways we are only now beginning to measure. The most devastating detail in this story is not that we built ugly schools. It is that we built schools that produce measurably worse outcomes, in cognition, in emotional well-being, in the fundamental capacity to learn, and we did it while believing we were being efficient. We optimized away the features that were actually working. What does it say about a society that it can look at the buildings it gives its children and find them adequate? What does it say about how we value childhood and thought and the future that is being formed in those corridors? I don't have a clean answer, but I think the question deserves to be asked, loudly and often. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything. And if this is the kind of history that matters to you, the invisible decisions that shape the world we're standing in, subscribe. New video every week. Let's keep pulling on these threads.